Hi, I'm Zane with the Astrology Collective, and we're here with Shawn Nygaard. Welcome, Shawn. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you for asking me to do this. It's great to talk with you.
I'd like to start off by asking you to talk a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where'd you grow up?
Well, I was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, USA, and I grew up in a little town next to Minneapolis called New Hope. And, I've kind of been all over the place in terms of not geography, but just in terms of studying things and interests, because I played the violin at one point. I was a peer counselor at another point. I studied music production, which if we talk about it later, plays into what brought me into astrology. But I come from a big family, more or less. And yeah, that's just a start.
My brothers and sisters.
I always have to pause. It's 7 of us total. I'm the youngest and I'm a twin. So I'm the oldest of the youngest, but we're both the youngest of the 7.
So the two of you are the youngest birth, but you're older than your twin.
Yes. Yep.
I came from a family with 1 sister and no brothers. So I mean, it's all alien,
Yeah.
Having a large family.
Yeah.
When most people, when they're children, they kind of have ideas about, when I grew up, I want to be, that type of thing. As a child, did you have anything particular or any things, if you went through phases that you really thought you'd like to be when you grew up?
To be honest, absolutely. There was kind of a fantasy that kept going around and kept coming back, because as a young kid, I fell in love with music and I fell in love with singers. And, I heard the singer Laura Branigan singing Gloria. Yeah. And that just became, I became, as a kid, synonymous with the song Gloria. And then everything Laura Branigan did, I just fell in love with. So I had fantasies about being a singer. But, in the same way, because I think a little bit later, I'll talk about Carl Jung, in the same way that Jung wanted to be an archaeologist and instead ended up with psychology, I've ended up doing astrology. And it's a link that I see in terms of, I'm using my voice. I'm just not a performer singer kind of a person. I was just far too shy for that. But I really like the idea of voice and the etymology linking it with vocation. So what is your voice in the world? What do you have to say in the world? And I think it runs a parallel with that fantasy as a kid of being a singer.
That's cool. Yeah, a little aside, I used to correspond with a gentleman who wrote classical compositions based on the discovery charts of each of the outer planets. So basically, you had an orchestral piece based on where not only that planet was, but all the other planets in the whole chart. And I still have the recording around somewhere. And I always thought, well, the music of the spheres, right? So
yeah, great connection. Yeah, exactly.
So you're an astrologer and you teach astrology as well. And how long have you been interested in astrology?
Well, to be honest, I didn't even know my sun sign before my Saturn return. And so I got into astrology after that through a series of, strange events that end up being connected. But I think overall, it ends up being now about 16 years kind of in it. But I was interested more maybe for the last 20 years.
Well, what drew you to the star signs once you did get an interest? What attracted you most?
Well, that's where it's to me, it's really interesting, but it's because, not knowing my sun sign, obviously I didn't really know much about astrology. And I went into events around my Saturn return led me to quit what I was doing and head into studying music production. And it was at a time in the music business and in the world where things were starting to change more and more from analog to digital. And more people were getting the tools for music production in their hands through personal computers. And what I started noticing, because as a kid, I followed the Billboard top 100 charts every week. And I would, go down to the newsstand and buy Billboard, and I would make little notes throughout the magazine and check marks by the charts. And so I would know how long songs spent on the charts. And when I was studying music production and then this switch to digital, which is faster, everything started moving faster and faster and faster. And I couldn't quite keep up as I was learning with imagining the speed of things if I was to enter that world. And so I started asking a question: what makes me go back to the music that I love so much? What makes me go back to Laura Branigan or another singer that I love, Sarah Brightman? What makes me go back to that music again and again and again? What makes music timeless versus what's heading up the charts right now and heading down faster, And, that was exactly the moment when I started connecting with the work of Carolyn Myss and archetypes. So it was as if that question of what makes music timeless came with an answer shortly thereafter about archetypes and the timeless realm, and just opening up that whole understanding of that realm. Well, not a whole understanding, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. I'm a serious believer in the concept that if you are very clear in your mind and you ask the universe a question, the universe will answer in a clear way.
Mm-hmm. And even if it's not entirely clear, I just like to keep that eye of, if you're asking a serious question, look alive for the answer. It's like, pay attention. And that's what I did. And, it led me right to astrology, because even though Carolyn Myss back then she taught directly about archetypes, she was teaching with Lynn Bell, who, a lot of people know from the Center for Psychological Astrology and her work elsewhere as well. But so that was what tied immediately from the start for me, astrology with archetypes. I've never understood one without the other.
Well, it is really difficult to have a in-depth understanding of anything astrological without the archetypes. It's all superficial without them. That's my perception.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree. Yeah.
So are you self-taught, or was Carolyn your teacher, or how did that come about?
When it comes to astrology, I'm self-taught and I'm not, in the sense that I'm very independent in how I learn and how I study things. And I just started, I started in the deep end with Liz Green's book, Astrology of Fate.
Oh, and I read that. Yeah.
Yeah. And, I loved it. So it just led to one thing and led to another. But, back then I would just track down, as, once I found an astrologer that I really liked, I would get everything that I could read by them, and I would go find all the audios online that I could purchase, which was not the same back then as it is now. It was a little trickier because everything has just become so much easier on the internet. But back then I would just find these organizations I'd never heard of that had a talk by this astrologer that I liked, and I would buy it. So I started having like a large audio collection of talks, and a lot of them are by people that I didn't pursue. But when I really found astrologers that I liked, I would get everything that I could find by them. And that way I learned, they were the ones who spoke to me. And I branch off and I learn other things, because I think it's just really good. It doesn't have to be only stuff that I love, but I just felt like those were the astrologers who speak to me, and that's how it makes sense to me.
I my beginning of astrology, the only thing available were cassette tapes for the speakers, and the only place you could get them would be if you went to a conference. But they didn't even have web pages. So, are there any particular astrologers that you would say had the greatest influence on your view, your astrology?
Sure. I mean, I would say, right off the bat, Liz Green, but very much Lynn Bell, because she was really the first person that I heard talking about astrology in person, when I, with the weekends with Carolyn Mace at her institute. So Lynn Bell and Darby Costello, the astrologers from the Center for Psychological Astrology, really spoke to me. And I said this to Lynn once, that I kind of imagined myself as a one-man CPA, one-man Center for Psychological Astrology. That was how I kind of approached doing astrology and what I was up to in the astrology world. I just kind of like their model. I liked what Liz Green was up to, and I just kind of, imagined myself that way. And I have to say, I really love Monica Domino. She's a brilliant teacher. She spent decades, I think, in South America, but there's recordings of her kind of all over the place. But she's past her Uranus return now, I believe. And so she's kind of quiet on the scene, but she's a brilliant teacher. And I've learned so much from her recordings and then talking with her at conferences.
How do you spell her last name?
I think it's Dimino.
I'll have to look her up. The name is not familiar to me, but then I don't know everybody.
Yeah. She's brilliant.
At the CMED Institute of Chicago, you studied the archetypes and symbolism, and your tutor for the Mercury Internet School of Psychological Astrology. I see you've spoken to the Minnesota Young Association and had a number of articles published in their publications, Elements. What comes to, how would you describe psychological astrology? Is it synonymous with archetypal astrology? Are they two different things?
Well, one of the ways that I think about this is there's all kinds of different psychologies, because each of us has our own psyche and, whether, connected and all that stuff, but it's like, at the deeper levels. But, how, psychological astrology to me is using astrology to get to know your own psyche in a different way, or to have your understanding and connection with your own psyche affirmed by the chart, by astrology, and then working with your psyche from that point on. But, astrology breaks down the way, or psychology breaks down the way I see it into, there's analytical psychology, and there's also archetypal psychology. And it's James Hillman who makes that distinction. And, there's a way that Jung starting analytical psychology, what he was up to was trying to translate what he had experienced in his soul in the Red Book, trying to translate that into the spirit of the times, which was very much to be validated. You wanted to be speaking the language of science.
Yes.
And so analytical psychology has a scientific kind of approach in a way, whereas archetypal psychology via James Hillman works much more aligned with the arts and culture and imagination. And that's where I love Jung for the analytical side, and I love Hillman for the archetypal side. And because Jung, he's actually who I would also add to my list of astrologers who influenced me, because he was an astrologer. He was very much, using charts and working with his patients. And, so there's just between the two of those guys, I just find an invaluable well of resource to dip into.
I for years I was a member of the Young Society of Western Australia, and I gave a couple of talks, astrological talks, and everybody there who attended knew a lot of astrology, even those that never did charts. So it's something that you pick up when you're studying psychology, Jungian. You pick up an interest in astrology, even if it doesn't become a driving force.
Right. And it's pretty clear now, it's because in Liz Green's recent work, it's pretty clear that Jung, founded his whole psychology in part on astrology. It's in the roots of everything that he was doing.
And it makes perfect sense. I mean, because all the research that Jung did, in different societies and stuff, he would have picked up that no matter whether he was in an African tribe or Samoan tribe or anywhere in the world, there was an astrology. I always thought that if somebody had a chance to talk to Joseph Campbell, he probably was into astrology, although I never heard it mentioned.
Yeah, I haven't heard that either, so I don't know.
So just on the off chance somebody does not know the term, what is an archetype?
It's, again, one of those terms where, because I've heard and learned archetypes from various teachers, everybody seems to have their own definition. But I really connect with Hillman's understanding of them as they're the patterns at the roots of the psyche that govern our experience.
I like that.
Yeah. It's simple, but it's a very big statement.
So you're getting into astrology and getting into Jungian ideas happen sort of like at the same time, would you say?
Well, it's interesting because in one way, yes, my awareness of that was at the same time, because I wasn't learning astrology ever without the archetypal connection, and the archetypal connection through the CPA was through like Lynn and through reading Liz Green is through Jung. But even earlier in my life as a teenager, I was really, really into the writing of Clive Barker. He started off as a horror writer,
I've read a few things. Yeah.
And Stephen King even said, bowed down to Clive Barker's writing. And he has since, he branched off into darker fantasy and then started writing, a whole kid series kind of thing. So varied. But there was a book he wrote, I believe in the 90s, called The Great and Secret Show, which he was influenced by Jung's notion of the collective unconscious. So he incorporated Jung's notion of the collective unconscious into his book, calling it quiddity. And so I was so drawn to that book, and I was so drawn to Clive Barker, but now I can see part of the reason why. I didn't know it back then, but, finding out along the way, by Clive Barker's new forward to that book where he talks about that, I was fascinated because, the idea fascinated me back then. I just didn't know it was associated with Jung.
That's absolutely fascinating to me. I mean, I went through a phase where I read good quality horror books. and I've read a few Clive Barker. I didn't read that one. So
yeah, it's a good book.
So if someone wanted to read some of your writings, where would you suggest they begin? I've seen a blog at imagineastrology.wordpress.com, but it doesn't seem like it's been updated recently. So
Yeah, I used to have a blog called The Night Ride, which NIGHT, the Night Ride, and I really liked that blog. And then when I got a website at imagineastrology.com, I thought I could be writing from my website, and I found that I really liked the format of WordPress for writing a blog, but it just became that I couldn't, really keep up both, and I would put stuff on my website. So really, there's stuff on that blog that you mentioned that isn't on my website. It's only there, but most everything that I have is on my website at imagineastrology.com. And there's specifically a tab called Articles that has links to articles that I've written for the Mountain Astrologer, for the Australian magazine Wellbeing, and other things that I've written just for my website. And it lists some on that articles page, but if you also, there's a lot that isn't listed on there. So it's just on, if you go through my website, you find, if you just go back and back and back, there's more than just that.
Okay. Have you published anything fairly recently that you'd like to draw people's attention to?
I think the most recent article that I wrote was for the Mountain Astrologer about Saturn in Aquarius. So on my website, that's at the top of the list of the articles. That's the most recent thing, but I've been more into teaching webinars and things. So I haven't been writing as much lately, but I was asked to, because I recently did a webinar on Pluto in Aquarius. And I was asked by the Mountain Astrologer to write an article, based on what I did in that webinar. So I'm in the process of starting to put that article together and write that for later this year. So
Mountain Astrologers has a nice place in my heart. Beautiful people who run it. Tim, who passed away, was an absolutely beautiful person. I know that Mountain Astrologer will sometimes approach somebody and say, "Hey, listen, we like such and such. Would you like to write an article on it for us?" I had written one on Eris, and they approached me. So it's
yeah, it's nice. It's nice to have that happen.
Any thought on writing a book, or are you working on a book?
I'm not working on a book. Part of me, just thinks, if something's already been written by people expressing it better than I can even, I don't need to reinvent that and write it for myself. So if I write a book, I eventually want to write something that, it might end up being a collection of essays or something, but it just, I don't want to duplicate efforts. And I like to really write something that comes from my own perspective and what I've learned and about, through the work I do. And I just haven't quite gotten the call to do that yet.
You don't write a book for the sake of writing a book. You write a book because you're called to write the book. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I feel like. Yeah.
All right, so let's discuss the talk that you're going to be giving for us. Tell us a little bit about what you're going to be discussing in your talk.
Yeah, the talk is called An Introduction to Archetypal Astrology. And I've done this talk twice before. This is a new iteration of it because I tend, even if I'm doing the same title talk, I do it differently. Some of it will be the same, but a lot of it will be different because if people want to if people get a hold of my recordings or things, they can watch the same thing in a different iteration because it'll have new pieces to it. So they're not just getting the same exact thing. And so this will be a new iteration because especially in the last couple of years with the pandemic and originally, with lockdown in 2020, a lot I've been, a lot has been shifting in the way that I perceive the world and the way that I perceive astrology and connect with things. So this talk will be, again, bringing in a lot of the work of James Hillman to sort of frame an understanding of archetypal psychology and then applying that to astrology. And one of the, key essential core pieces of Hillman, which he states in the very beginning of the very first volume of his uniform editions of essays, is, that he roots his psychology in the imagination, in the Western imagination. And I pick it up from there and kind of take that and go through some key ideas from Hillman and then apply them to astrology through examples in charts. And I don't know yet if I'm going to do the same kind of thing, but what I've done in the past is use the sixth house as an example of going, how to approach the sixth house archetypally. And following with examples because there are some very good examples. So we'll see. I'm still deciding which. I'd like to focus on a house and then use chart examples because that brings in the planets as well. Whatever planets will be in the chart, but to just look at them archetypally, it goes back to the Hellenistic times with the names of the houses from the Hellenistic times that come through Deborah Holding's book, Temples of the Sky, which for me evokes so much imagination, the way the Greeks looked at the names of the houses and came up with the houses. So it's really looking at it from that archetypal perspective rather than an analytical perspective. So it's rooted in imagination and comes through more image than theory or anything like that.
I'm just starting to go mentally through the houses and thinking of what would I name this house? Sorry, I went off.
No, that's great.
So what do you feel is the most important thing you would like people to take away with them when they attend your talk? An idea, a train of thought?
This might be, different if you ask me tomorrow, and it might be different, by the time we get to the webinar, but it's, I think I really just like the distinction between the analytical and the archetypal, and that the importance of imagination as kind of the engine for working with astrology, rather than, for example, technique being the engine. Technique is really important. I just, there's a quote from the Romantic, John Ruskin from the Romantic era, where he says, the imagination is never governed. It is always the ruling and divine power. And that links really well with Hillman's archetypal psychology. And so you want to go to that place that is never governed. It's the ruling power. So let's go there and see what happens if we move from that as the engine, because then technique can fall in line rather than leading the charge through mechanics versus imagination.
That's cool. The word that just popped in my head was when the Jung mentioned from time to time was daemon.
Yeah. I mean, that's essential for what Hillman wrote about in the Soul's Code. The daimon and the which is the genie in another culture. It's the genius in Rome, and in a lot of ways it's the guardian angel in Christianity. It's just, tweaked very differently for, in Christianity, but it's the same kind of idea that we all have this inherent, connection in our soul to this, it's a being in the imagination, in the soul, who, knows what we're here for. Whereas we forget, when we're born, what we're here for, and we can lose track. But there's this being, there's this imaginative being that, that has our best interests at heart to guide us on our way.
Is there anything else that you might like to share with us before we finish up?
I think I'll just add, just say just a little bit more that, from, in 2020, I was listening to a series of salons. Once the pandemic started, there was a series of salons about the Red Book. And I tuned in every week. And it was, before that, I had started reading the Red Book seriously. And so this was just a wonderful way to continue reading the Red Book chapter by chapter by chapter. And there's this fascinating, Jung distinguishes in the Red Book between the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. And one of the things that he says at the beginning is, and the soul is what connects us into the depths, whereas the spirit of the times is more associated the way that and I'm going to bring this into the webinar when I teach it. The spirit of the times is more linked with ego. And it's like Jung's personality number 1 versus his personality number 2 being linked with the spirit of the depths. But he says in the beginning of the Red Book that the wealth of the soul exists in images. And then he proceeds through the Red Book he had felt he had lost connection with his soul. The whole Red Book is his reconnection with the soul. And towards the end, his soul actually says to him, after all this work that he's done, I give you payment in images. So it's that idea that the Red Book is a work of archetypal psychology. So Hillman had never read the Red Book, but somehow what he intuited throughout all of his archetypal psychology is what Jung had already done in the Red Book. And so it's this idea of the wealth of the soul existing in images. To be connected with the images of your soul is really the core of what I love with astrology.
Sounds like a great title for a book, Connected to the Images of Your Soul.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. You mentioned your website earlier. Do you want to just mention the address again, in case anybody wants to check it out?
Yep, it's imagineastrology.com.
Okay, thank you. Looking forward to your talk, and I'm gonna end the recording now. That's something I wanted to ask you, but I'm not going to put it on the recording. So thank you very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great.